to 4 nations, 1 West. And most people can't name a single one of them correctly. The Sioux, the Apache, the Comanche, and the Cheyenne. Hollywood collapsed them into a single silhouette on a ridge. But a Sioux warrior and an Apache warrior couldn't have exchanged a single word without a translator. Their languages belonged to entirely separate language families. Their territories stretched across more than 1.5 million square miles. Their histories with the United States government followed the same pattern: treaty, betrayal, dispossession, and war. Each time on different ground, in different terrain, against different people who'd been promised the same thing. This is what actually happened to each of them, in their own words and on their own land. Let's start with the mistake that poisons everything: the idea that Plains Indians were one people. They were not. The 4 nations we're riding with today spoke languages so different from one another that a Sioux warrior and an Apache warrior couldn't have exchanged a single word without a translator. The Sioux spoke a Siouan tongue shaped by the northern plains. The Cheyenne spoke Algonquian, a language family that stretches east all the way to the Atlantic coast. The Comanche spoke Uto-Aztecan, with cousins in the deserts of Mexico. And the Apache spoke Athabascan, a language family with its deepest roots in the subarctic forests of Canada, as far north as you can get and still call it the same continent. These people did not share a language. They did not share a world. Their territories stretched across more than 1.5 million square miles, from the frozen Dakotas down to the Chihuahuan Desert. To call them the same people is like pointing at a map of Europe and saying everyone on it is identical. The land alone tells you different. Now, the Sioux. When most people picture the warriors of the American West, they're picturing the Lakota, and that reputation was earned in blood. The Sioux weren't a single tribe. They were 3 allied confederacies: the Lakota, the Dakota, and the Nakota, organized around 7 council fires known as the Oseti-Sakowin. By the 1860s, the Lakota in particular had become the most formidable military force on the northern plains. They controlled the Black Hills, Paha, Sapa, sacred ground, along with the Powder River country and hunting ranges that fed thousands of people through the brutal Dakota winters. The U.S. government recognized this power in the Fort Laramie Treaty of 1868. The Black Hills were guaranteed to the Sioux, and I'll give you the exact language the government used: for as long as the grass shall grow and the rivers flow. 6 years later, Lieutenant Colonel George Custer led an expedition into those same hills and confirmed what prospectors had whispered: gold. The treaty was dead before the ink had time to fade in memory. What followed was the Great Sioux War of 1876, and on June 25th of that year, on a ridge above the Little Bighorn River in Montana, roughly 2,000 Lakota and Cheyenne warriors met the U.S. 7th Cavalry. In less than an hour, 268 American soldiers were dead, including Custer himself. It was the single most devastating defeat the U.S. Army suffered on the frontier. The nation was shocked. The Army regrouped, and within a year, the Lakota were broken. Not by superior tactics, but by relentless pursuit through winter, the slaughter of their horses, and the systematic destruction of their food supply. The legal fight over the Black Hills is not ancient history. In 1980, the United States Supreme Court ruled that the seizure of that land was illegal and awarded the Sioux Nation $105 million in compensation. The Lakota refused to take it. They still refuse today. They want the land, not the money. That case remains open, but the Sioux were fighting a government that was at least new to the business of breaking promises in the West. The Apache had been doing this for 200 years before the U.S. Army showed up. What happened when a nation that had already outlasted the Spanish Empire met a new enemy who thought they could do better? That's where we're going next. Move south and west, deep into the canyon country and desert basins of the Southwest, and you enter Apache territory. The Apache were not a single unified tribe either. They were a constellation of independent bands: Chiricahua, Mescalero, Guerrilla, Western Apache, connected by a common Athabascan linguistic ancestry but operating on their own terms. They had been raiding Spanish settlements since the late 1600s. By the time the U.S. Army arrived, the Apache had already been fighting colonial powers for 2 centuries. They were not new to this. Their military philosophy was pure guerrilla warfare, refined over generations. Small units, intimate knowledge of brutal terrain. Ambush, strike, vanish. Apache warriors could cover 70 miles on foot in a single day across country that broke the legs of army horses. The Sonoran and Chihuahuan deserts were not obstacles to them. They were weapons. In 1885, a Chiricahua leader named Geronimo broke from the San Carlos Reservation with a band of 38 warriors. What followed should have been a brief pursuit. Instead, those 38 men held off approximately 5,000 U.S. troops and 500 Mexican soldiers across 2 sovereign nations for more than a year. The math alone should stop you cold. 1 warrior for every 140 soldiers, and they were never defeated in the field. Geronimo surrendered in September 1886 on negotiated terms. The reward for that surrender was imprisonment. Geronimo died a prisoner of war at Fort Sill, Oklahoma, in 1909. He was never permitted to return to Arizona. The land he had defended for his entire life, he never saw again. Geronimo died in Oklahoma in 1909, still classified as a prisoner of war. He'd held off 5,000 soldiers with 38 men. The U.S. government's answer to that was captivity until death. Now here's the thing. The Apache had been fighting Europeans for 2 centuries before they lost. The nation we're riding into next built an empire in 50 years. The Comanche didn't inherit power from anyone. They created it from scratch, on horseback, in less than a single lifetime. And they stopped the Spanish Empire before the United States was even a country. The Comanche acquired horses around the year 1700. Within 50 years, they had become something no one on the continent had seen before: a fully mounted, highly mobile, militarily dominant power that controlled a territory historians now call Comancheria, roughly 240,000 square miles of the southern plains. They didn't just ride horses. They bred them, traded them, and weaponized them with a skill that left European observers reaching for comparisons to the Mongols. Some individual Comanche bands held horse herds, numbering in the thousands. Here's a fact that never makes it into the Westerns. The Comanche stopped the Spanish Empire. Spain spent over a century attempting to push its frontier northward out of Mexico. The Comanche stopped that expansion cold, raiding deep into Spanish territory and making settlement above certain latitudes effectively impossible. An indigenous nation on horseback halted a European empire. That happened. By the early 1800s, the Comancheria was the dominant political and military reality of the southern plains. American settlers, traders, and soldiers learned quickly that Comanche territory was not entered lightly. What finally broke them was not a battle. It was a business decision. The systematic slaughter of the southern buffalo herd, driven by commercial hide hunters flooding into Texas in the early 1870s, destroyed the foundation of Comanche life. The Red River War of 1874 to 1875 delivered the final blow. U.S. forces didn't need to outfight the Comanche. They burned their winter supplies and killed 1,400 of their horses. A people who had built an empire on the horse were left with nothing to ride and nothing to eat. From an estimated 40,000 Comanche at their peak, fewer than 1,500 remained alive by 1900. 40,000 Comanche, 1,500 left by 1900. The destruction of a food supply accomplished what decades of warfare could not. Every nation in this story lost, but one of them was massacred under a flag of truce, while flying a U.S. government flag from their own camp having been told explicitly that they were under federal protection. The Cheyenne story doesn't start in battle. It starts with a promise that was designed to be broken, and what came after that morning is the reason they were standing at Little Bighorn 12 years later. The Cheyenne began as agricultural people near the Great Lakes, growing crops and living in settled villages. Then the horse reached them in the mid-1700s, and within a generation they had become nomadic hunters of the Great Plains, one of the fastest and most complete cultural reinventions in frontier history. By the early 1800s, geography had split them into two groups: the Northern Cheyenne, ranging across present-day Montana and Wyoming, and the Southern Cheyenne, further down into Colorado and Kansas. What held them together, even across that distance, were two sacred objects: the medicine arrows and the buffalo hat, which gave the Cheyenne a spiritual cohesion that survived physical separation. They were also, compared to some of their neighbors, skilled diplomats, building alliances with the Arapaho that lasted for generations. Their relationship with the United States government followed the same pattern as every other nation on this list. The Fort Laramie Treaty of 1851 recognized their territorial boundaries. The discovery of gold in Colorado in 1858 ended that recognition. What followed was Sand Creek. On the morning of November 29, 1864, Colonel John Chivington led a militia force against a Cheyenne and Arapaho encampment at Sand Creek, Colorado. The encampment was flying a U.S. flag and a white flag of truce. The people inside, approximately 230, the majority of them women, children, and elderly, had been told they were under the protection of the U.S. government. Chivington attacked anyway. The massacre galvanized every fractured alliance on the plains. The Cheyenne who survived Sand Creek became some of the most committed fighters of the subsequent wars. They were present at Little Bighorn. That was not coincidence. That was consequence. Now hold all four of these nations in your mind at once and look at the pattern. Every one of these nations had a piece of paper, a treaty, a signature, a promise from the United States government that their land was their land. The Sioux had the Black Hills guaranteed in 1868. Gold was found in 1874. The paper didn't matter. The Apache were promised a reservation in their Arizona homeland in 1872. It was dissolved 4 years later. The paper didn't matter. The Comanche watched their buffalo, their entire food system, their economy, their way of war, deliberately slaughtered for hides while the U.S. Army looked away. No paper was going to stop that. And the Cheyenne were massacred while flying the flag that was supposed to protect them. The paper was the flag. It meant nothing. 4 different peoples, 4 different languages, 4 different ways of living on the land. One method applied again and again until it worked. It wasn't military genius. It wasn't manifest destiny working itself out through some invisible hand. It was a deliberate, documented, repeated policy of agreement and betrayal, carried out across decades against nations that had every legal and moral right to the ground beneath their feet. Hollywood gave you one Indian and one story. The real West had 4 nations, each of them ancient, complex, and worth knowing by name. If this kind of history is what you ride for, hit that subscribe button and leave a like. It keeps this channel going and tells us you want more stories that deserve to be told straight. And before you ride out, I want to hear from you. Of these 4 nations, which one do you think history has treated most unjustly and why? Leave your answer below.